I was once exploring a bookshop with a friend. We were going through a stack of them to see how different works are shown. He handed me one book which was already open. I didn't know who the photographer was. I didn't know when, where, or why the photos were taken. I just remember that the work captivated me. It was love at first sight, the uncomplicated kind, before you know anything that could complicate it. Then I turned to the cover to reveal the two words which will change my view of photography as an art: Vivian Maier. That name became a bit of an obsession, as many materials I could find about her: documentaries, blogs, articles, YouTube essays, forum threads written by the people who had clearly spent more hours on this than was reasonable. As I said, obsession at first sight. There was something obviously common in all of these. Almost no words were from her. What we have instead is a few letters and tape recordings, the memories of people who were children when they knew her, trying decades later to describe a woman who worked hard not to be described. And into that gap, everyone with an opinion has poured their theories, hidden as self projection, a version of her that makes the rest of us feel better about something. So, as honesty demands of me, this is also something like that. It's my perspective, built from the same fragments everyone else has, on two questions that keep getting asked about her and keep getting answered badly. Did she ever want to show her work? And how would she have felt finding out how famous she has become? People who knew her were asked to describe her in a single word, not her work, but her as a person. That word was substantial. Here's a version of the story you probably heard: a nanny, quietly brilliant, who took photographs her entire life and showed almost no one, pure and untouched by ambition. An accident of genius, discovered at the end of her life in a storage locker she couldn't afford to keep paying for. It's a beautiful story. It's also, I think, a story we needed more than she did. Because notice what we don't do with other kinds of artists. A musician who wants a record deal isn't accused of loving music less. A director who wants a box office opening isn't seen as a lesser filmmaker for it. We fully expect actors, rock stars, and celebrated names to want money and recognition, and we don't think it costs them anything artistically to want it. But hand that same want to a photographer, a painter, a poet, especially one working quietly and who isn't already famous, and suddenly the desire becomes suspicious. Wanting to be seen becomes evidence against the purity of the work. That's not a rule about art. That's a rule about which artists we have decided are allowed to want things and others are not. And I think the reason Vivian's story got flattened into "she never wanted this" is that the alternative is uncomfortable. If she wanted to sell her work, if she tried more than once and it simply didn't happen for her, then her story stops being a fable amount of purity and starts being a story about a working artist who did what working artists do. She tried. Some of it worked, a lot of it didn't. She kept going anyway. For many, that's a much less of an interesting story to tell at a dinner party. It's also, I think, the true one. So, which is it? Protecting her or protecting us? I don't think it's really about her at all. I think we build the myth of an artist who never wanted anything because it lets us off the hook of our own wanting. If greatness requires that kind of purity, and we've already wanted things, a promotion, an audience, then we have disqualified ourselves before we have started. It's a clean and quiet exit, and even more problematic part, it is accepted by most people, and by most people, I mean the non artists. But I'm not interested in such exits, so let's actually look at what she did. In 1950s, Vivian went back to France to sell her family's estate. While she was there, she started shooting obsessively with a simple box camera, and she found a mentor, a man named Amedy Simon, who ran a photo shop in a small village called Saint Bonnet. Simon taught her to develop film, he taught her to print, and together they built something that doesn't fit the she never wanted to be seen story at all, a postcard business. She wrote to him afterward with a kind of pride that borders on cheeky. She called her landscape shots, and I'm not exaggerating the phrasing, her masterpieces of the chainsaw. She had a stack of them and she told him, a big stack, and if she said so herself, they weren't bad. That's not the voice of someone allergic to recognition. That's the voice of someone who knew what she made and wanted someone else to see it too. When she got back to New York, the ambition didn't stop. She drafted an actual business plan. She upgraded her equipment to a Rolleiflex, a serious camera, specifically because it gave her work a more polished, professional quality. She sought out other photographers to learn from. She sold some advertising shots for a dollar a piece, which is not a lot of money, but it is unmistakably someone trying. And here's the detail I find most telling. She was picky about her prints, difficult by her own admission. She wasn't satisfied with the labs in New York, so she proposed something almost absurd, mailing her negatives back across the Atlantic so her French mentor could print them properly, because she genuinely believed no one in New York could do the work justice. You don't get that particular, that demanding about something you don't care whether anyone sees. So, no, I don't think she was a naive hobbyist who stumbled into greatness. I think she was a disciplined artist who tried more than once to build a professional path for this work. It just didn't take, and somewhere along the way, something in her shifted from wanting to share the image to needing to process the moment. We'll get to that, but I want to be clear about the starting point because it matters. The ambition was real, it just didn't get to the finish line. Let's talk about the part of her life that actually took up most of her waking hours, the nanny job. Photography, even in the cheapest era of film photography, was not cheap. Film, chemicals, cameras, repairs, do that for decades and you're looking at a genuinely significant expense, especially on the income of a live-in caregiver in the second half of the 20th century. They don't still call it the expensive hobby for nothing. Many people need a job, the kind that pays rent, not the kind that feeds the soul, specifically so that they could keep affording the photography that need to feed the soul. It's not a contradiction. That's just what it costs to keep making the thing you love when the thing you love doesn't pay for itself yet. And there's a strange flicker of guilt considered by many when they ask for money for their art, like they just let something transactional into the space that used to be just theirs. But that guilt doesn't hold up under any real scrutiny. Needing money for your art doesn't mean you love the art less. It means you live in a world with rent. I'd actually go further than that, because I don't think it's only about the rent. I think there's a broader idea buried in how uncomfortable we get watching an artist charge money. The belief that art loses value the moment it touches commerce, but an artist can be completely present in the making of something, full of nothing but feeling the moment, the expression, and that same image can later exist in a commercial context without losing a single ounce of what it meant when it was made. Those aren't contradictions, they're just two different rooms the same photograph gets to stand in. So when I picture Vivian Maier's actual days, that's the image I keep returning to. Someone else's children, someone else's schedule, someone else's house. And then in early mornings or evenings, she managed to steal the moments. She went out into the city and did the real work, even without developing most of it and not seeing the results. Just doing it, walk after walk, roll after roll, because the process was the point regardless of what came after. She wasn't a woman with a hobby that happened to be photography. She was a photographer whose day job happened to be childcare, and she made her life bend to fit the art, not the other way around. Here's the detail that changed how I think about her entire story. People who knew her, the families she worked for, the children she raised, describe her as almost never being without a camera. Not she often bought a camera or she liked to photograph, as if it was a part of her rather than a separate object. Sit with that phrasing for a second, because I think it quietly answers the question everyone keeps asking wrong. We keep asking, did she ever want to display her work? But that question assumes the camera was a tool she used to make a separate thing called the work, the way a carpenter uses a saw to make a separate thing called the table. And once the table exists, the question of whether to sell it, show it, or hide it, that's a real separate decision. But what if the camera wasn't a tool in the sense at all? What if, for her, it functioned less like an instrument and more like an extension of her actual self? The way your eyes are not a tool you use to see, they are just how you see. If that's true, then asking did she ever want to show her work is a little bit like asking did she want to display her hands. It's not that the answer is obviously no, it's that the question is aimed at the wrong target entirely. You don't display a hand, you use it. The making itself might have been the whole transaction, complete on its own terms, whether or not anyone ever saw what it produced. I think that's the real difference between an artist who makes work and an artist who is the making. Most of us are the first kind, or at least some of the time. We finish something, then decide separately what to do with it. I don't know that Vivian ever fully separated those two acts. The evidence suggests she tried to, more than once, with Simon, with the postcards, with the business plan, but I don't think that impulse ever became then the daily, the wordless habit of simply lifting the camera and looking. It's not a romantic flourish. I think it's closer to the literal truth of who she was. Now set the psychology aside for a second. The privacy, the guardedness of all of it. Let's just stop the mechanics. Street photography, the kind she practiced, depends on a specific kind of invisibility. You need to be part of the crowd, not a figure the crowd had organized itself around. The moment someone recognizes you as a photographer, let alone a famous one, the street stops behaving naturally. People adjust their faces. They perform a version of themselves for the lens instead of simply living in front of it. The entire method she'd built, walking unnoticed through safer streets and the rougher ones alike, catching what she called the ordinary choreography of daily life, depends entirely on nobody looking back at her, or at least for most parts. Fame complicates that entire process. So when people ask whether anonymity was something that she chose or something the work demanded of her, I don't think that's an actually a clean either or. I think both things were true, and they were probably related. She was, by every account, a genuinely private person, the kind who might answer a personal question with something implying towards that's not for you to know, and mean it. But she was also practicing a craft that required exactly the kind of invisibility to function at all. Her temperament and her method weren't fighting each other, they were the same shape. And there's the third layer worth naming honestly. She was also responsible for other people's children, a public profile, attention, strangers approaching her on street. That's a real complication for someone whose actual job was keeping kids safe. I don't know how much that weighed into it, given the fact that she actually did went to rougher areas with the kids sometimes, but it could not possibly be nothing. Whether or not she ever fully knew it, the fame would have taken the condition her entire method was built on and quietly removed it. I don't want to leave you with a story that resolves too cleanly because her actual story doesn't. By the end of her life, Vivian had roughly 45,000 exposures she never developed. rolls and rolls of undeveloped films stacked in boxes, alongside unopened mail, in a life that had slid, by most accounts, into a real and difficult collection. And here's the problem that creates for the tidy version of my own argument. If the camera really was inseparable from her, an extension of herself rather than a tool for producing a separate object called the work, then why keep the negatives at all? Why not simply take the photograph and let it go, the way you would let a thought pass through without needing to record it? Hoarding the film in its own way, still a kind of holding on to the results. It suggests you care what happened to the images, even if she never let herself find out. And I don't think that makes her any less remarkable. If anything, it makes the fact that she kept walking out there, camera in hand, decades after decades, more impressive, not less. Any artist who's worked long enough will tell you it isn't all clarity and momentum. These are long stretches of doubt of doing the work without any evidence it matters. She did all that as a woman in the middle of 20th century, walking into the parts of city that weren't always safe, with a job and a household depending on her showing up the next morning regardless. That's the kind of discipline most people never test in themselves. Let's go back to that one word, substantial. Not talented or gifted, substantial. The word you'd use for something with real felt weight to it, something that doesn't move when you push onto it. I think that word fits her better than any of the theories people have built around her, because it doesn't try to resolve the contradictions. It just describes the person who held it. She could want to sell her work and still be someone who mostly didn't. She could be private to the point of curtness and still live behind hours of tape recordings where she interviewed strangers with real curiosity. She could care enough about her prints to fight with printers across an ocean and still let 45,000 roll, still sit undeveloped in the dark. None of that need to be resolved into a single clean trait. Substantial people are allowed to be more than just one thing at once. So, does the work need an audience to be real? I used to think that was the real question here. I don't anymore. I think the work was already real the moment she pressed the shutter. The same way a feeling is real before anyone else hears you name it. The audience, us. Decades later, going through her boxes, we didn't make the work real. We just finally showed up for it. There is something else I wonder after listening to the word substantial. It's about the gap between what she could see through the viewfinder and what she could bear to see printed early in her life. It's what pushed her back to Simon, back to the business plan demanding better prints from the difficult New York labs. What would her selection look like? A verdict on her seeing delivered by her own eyes instead of what we have seen so far. So here's where I land. I would love to meet her. I would want to sit with her somewhere quiet, a bench, a street corner, it doesn't matter, and just watch the light shift in her eyes, like the thousands of times before, without ever needing to explain why she was watching the streets. I think I would be able to understand some parts of it, but I also wouldn't want to meet her, because I know, as well as I know anything about her, that she might really not have wanted this. Not the documentaries, the essays, not even this video. She was a private person who became a public sensation entirely without her consent, discovered by an accident of circumstance rather than an act of will. Every bit of attention we've given her since is something she never asked for, and by most evidence would have actively resisted. So, loving her work and wishing I could ask her about it will always sit right next to the kind of respect that says maybe the kindest thing is to leave her alone. Both of those are true. I have made my peace with holding them at the same time. And here's the last thing I want to leave you with, because it's the part that actually matters most to me. Her life, for me, is the proof that such high form of dedication towards one's art is possible, that you can live an entire life mostly unseen, mostly unrewarded, and unfinished by your own standards, and still, without ever intending to, end up inspiring countless people. She wasn't trying to inspire anyone, she was just trying to see clearly and to keep showing for the seeing, role after role, for decades, with no guarantee that any of it would matter to a single other person. It mattered anyway. Maybe that's the real answer to the question everyone keeps asking. Not whether she wanted to be found, but what it looks like to do the work as if being found was never the point at all, and to be so complete in that, so substantial that the finding happened anyway. If this one resonated, let me know in the comments. I would genuinely like to hear which part of her story you carry with you. Like, subscribe, and share it with someone who makes things nobody asked them to make. And until next time.